everyone, to those of you who are in Washington, D.C., and good morning to all of you who are in Seoul. This is the second event that we've co-hosted with the Sejong Institute, and I'd like to thank my friend Hak-Soon Park, who is the head of the Institute, for working together with us, and also to mention that the program is made possible through funding from the Uni-Korea Foundation, and we greatly appreciate their support. My name is Joel Witt. I'm going to be moderating tonight's discussion. And I say discussion because we're not going to have any presentations like is normally done. We're just going to talk among ourselves for the first 40 minutes or so. And then we're going to turn to questions from the audience. So feel free at any time to type your questions into the Q&A box, and we're going to try to get to as many as possible. We'll probably bunch a number of them together that are similar in nature. So hopefully we'll be able to include all of you. For the speakers, please remember to mute yourselves when you're not speaking, but feel free to respond to each other as we go along. Just motion to me when you want to add on. With that, I'm going to introduce the panelists for the evening, and I'm just going to do this very briefly. If you want to learn more about each person, you can refer to the event page. First, there's my good friend Suzanne Dimaggio, who's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And Suzanne has had a great deal of experience talking in track 2 discussions, particularly with North Korea. So I'm very happy to have her here this evening. Secondly, we have Dr. Ji-Won Hong, who is a professor of international relations at the University of Seoul. And he has a number of different experiences, including working on several advisory positions for the Korean government. Third, we have Dr. Jung-Sup Kim, who's a senior research fellow at the Sejong Institute and has a wealth of experience in the Ministry of Defense in South Korea. So we're very happy to have him here this evening. And finally, my colleague Jenny Town, who's a fellow at the Stimson-Center and is the deputy director of the Stimson-Center's 38 North program. We have questions that we've sent to the participants in advance. So why don't we start off our discussion with one of those questions? And I think it's probably best directed at an American, although our Korean colleagues are certainly welcome to join in. And that is, we're already a month into the Biden administration. And I think for most of us, it's very hard to figure out exactly what the approach towards North Korea is going to be. So what I wanted to do is do a little bit of crystal ball reading and looking at what key officials have said about North Korea before and taking office. And I'm going to start off asking Suzanne, because Suzanne is also familiar with these people as well. She's had contact with them in other incarnations. So I'm wondering, Suzanne, what do you think the Biden administration is going to do when it comes to North Korea?
Well, first, let me say thanks for organizing this event, Joel, Jenny, and Stimson, and of course, Sejong. I'm really happy to be part of this discussion. So here's the bottom line. We still really don't know much about what direction the Biden administration is going to take. The only thing we know for sure is that they are carrying out a policy review, and that is expected to take months to complete. Whether it's, some people are saying maybe June it will be completed, others are saying probably sooner. So if we look at what's happened between now and since Biden's inauguration, there have been a few hints on what the direction might be. I mean, first of all, President Biden and President Moon had a call. I think it was very early in February. And in that discussion, of course, they emphasized the US ROK alliance and reached agreement to closely coordinate on North Korea. So nothing very big there. And President Moon also proposed joint efforts to advance the denuclearization and peace building process on the Korean Peninsula. And if you look at what then Secretary Blinken and his counterpart have had similar discussions. Most notably, I think the major theme that has emerged so far is not a surprise, and that is really ramping up coordination with allies. And we just saw a few days ago a trilateral meeting that brought together the US, Japan, and South Korea virtually to discuss the shared North Korea-related challenge. So this is a clear signal from the Biden team that their approach to North Korea is going to be quite different than the previous administrations. And by that, I mean really working with allies and using that as the centerpiece of our North Korea policy going forward. Also notably, actively encouraging better ties between Seoul and Tokyo. Now, if we shift to the State Department spokesman, he said a number of things on North Korea so far. First, he made the point of, yes, there is no direct engagement, but don't confuse that as any indication that North Korea isn't a priority. Again, he emphasized the complete focus now is on coordination with allies, get on the same page about both policy and strategy. He also expressed concern about risk in moving too soon, asserting that it's much more important to do the diplomatic legwork before the US takes an approach. Again, quite different from the preceding administration. So this emphasis on close cooperation with allies as a key component is not going to come as a surprise to the North Koreans. They're fully expecting this. What I think the North Koreans are eagerly awaiting is to hear about is the substance. Is it going to be different from the Trump administrations? And specifically, will the approach to full denuclearization up front before receiving any concessions, will that be held over? It's unclear at the moment how the Biden team will approach this question. When Secretary Blinken was asked if denuclearization, full denuclearization was an unrealistic objective, he deferred. But he indicated that he acknowledged that it's a problem that's gotten worse over time across administrations, both Republicans and Democrats, and that's why they're doing the review. Also of interest, I think, is if the Biden administration plans to attempt engagement, when it will happen. And here we have some insight from Kurt Campbell before he joined the administration at an event at the Atlantic Council. He made a point that the Biden administration should make an early decision about North Korea policy. He noted that the Obama administration did a rather prolonged period of study. And during that time, the North Koreans took a number of provocative steps. And he said that basically headed off the possibility of engagement. So he seems very sensitized to that, and maybe he will push a engagement process forward sooner rather than later. So those are the things that stick out to me so far of what this administration is saying. I think they're holding things close to the vest while they carry out this review. If you want some ideas on how they should move forward, then we can come back to that later, Joel.
Yeah, I should mention Suzanne and I co-chaired a working group that came up with a principled diplomatic strategy for North Korea, and it was just published on our website. So we have a lot to talk about in that context, but let's first stick to this issue. So yeah, I think it's very clear the Biden administration is it's gonna cross all the T's and dot all the I's before it moves forward. So the issue, I think, for our South Korean friends, I wanna turn to both of you, and please, whoever wants to answer this question, go ahead. I think the issue for our South Korean friends is this seems to be a real opportunity for President Moon to push his agenda forward. And I'm wondering, what do you think, first of all, what do you think President Moon, beyond the sort of boilerplate talking point about the phone conversation, what do you think President Moon is saying to President Biden or the Biden administration? Maybe Dr. Kim, or Dr. Wang, why don't you start?
Okay, let me start first. I also want to thank you again for inviting me to this wonderful seminar. I also agree with the Sujan in that the Biden administration has not come up with a new North Korea policy yet, because they are now conducting the policy review. What does the President Moon want the Biden the administration to talk about the North Korea policy? I think that the President Moon wants to persuade the President Biden out of the strategic patience. It seems to me that most people believe that the Biden's North Korea policy looks like that of the Obama administration. There is that strategic patience. However, I believe that the Biden is gonna go beyond the Obama North Korea policy because he cannot even up the policy, the strategic patience, because the situation has changed a lot since the Obama left 2016. So I think that the Biden, I think that the President Moon wants to the Biden administration to keep in mind that the strategic patience is no longer possible. After the Obama left, the North Korea conducted 6 nuclear tests and several more ballistic the missile testing. Especially after North Korea test fired it's the Hwasong-15 on the ICBM class rocket in November 2017. It declared that the completion of the nuclear deterrence capability against the United States. So North Korea is no longer a remote threat anymore. So the North Korea now should be the top national security priority. So I think that the strategic patience will not work for Biden, and maybe the President Moon Jae-in wants to talk about that to President Biden. So I also believe that the Biden administration should go beyond the Obama's North Korea policy. So it seems to me that Biden's North Korea policy may begin with the small step in which the United States and North Korea can narrow down their differences and exchange several detailed agendas. And that's what the Moon Jae-in government, expect the Biden administration to do for the North Korea policy. I also want to add that some point, especially there are several scholars, even in the Washington D.C., several scholars and the policy analysts, the proposal about the interim agreement, for example, Michael O'Halloran and Robert Einhorn and even the Victor Cha also talked about that the small deal or the mini deal or the interim agreement, the last year, the foreign affairs. So I also think that the Mr. Joel Reed also will support this idea. So it seems to me that the President Moon may think that those interim agreement between the United States and North Korea, they may pave the way for the inter-Korean cooperation. Okay.
Dr. Kim, did you want to add something to that?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I agree with Dr. Hwang that many South Koreans are concerned that the Biden administration might repeat the so-called strategic patience. So in that sense, I think there is a fundamental questions that we need to think about, which is how much risk are the United States and South Korea willing to take to achieve the denuclearized Korean Peninsula? Many people just assume that North Korea will not give up its nuclear weapons and prefer maintaining a pressure strategy. But pressure strategy alone is not enough. It cannot solve the problem. So we do not, and we do not know North Korea's intentions for sure until we try. Of course, the US distrust of North Korea is very strong, and this is also shared by most South Koreans. However, we are not in a position to ignore North Korea, even if it cannot be trusted. Every day, the North Korean nuclear capability is advancing. So I think the risk-taking is inevitable when dealing with the untrustworthy negotiation partner. North Korea may cheat and betray the United States and South Korea again. But the risk of failure that the United States and South Korea may face will not be so fatal. We can manage the risk level in devising our negotiation strategy. So I believe that the United States and South Korea should be willing to take some risk and make a detailed and elaborate negotiation plan that can test North Korea's ultimate intentions. And in that sense, the issue of sanctions relief is very important. Sanctions relief is a difficult question. To what extent and what point the sanctions will be mitigated or lifted is not an easy question. However, we should note that the pressure alone cannot bring North Korea to its knees. Sanctions can make the North Korean regime suffer, but it cannot make the North give up its nuclear weapons. That's what the history of more than 20 years of negotiation with Pyongyang shows. So my point is that the goal is the denuclearization, and the sanction is a mean. Therefore, sanctions relief card based on snapback can be and should be flexibly used. I know the United States is hesitant to provide incentives due to distrust of North Korea, but I think there is no reason why the United States cannot try if it is conditional incentives. If North Korea violates the agreement, then the United States can go back to sanctions. So we need to find out Pyongyang's intentions and calculations through serious negotiations.
Thanks. I'd like to get more into the details in a few minutes about agreements, because both of you have raised some interesting points there. But there's another point that Dr. Wang made, and you know, for those of us who follow North Korea, follow the Korean Peninsula, you know, whenever I go to one of these meetings, we talk about how dealing with North Korea is an important priority. And certainly that's true for South Korea. But, you know, I often wonder, is it really an important priority for the United States? So I'm going to play a little devil's advocate here and note that, you know, it may not be as important a priority as we all think it is. I think that was certainly true for a lot of the Obama administration. There were other more pressing issues, other more important issues. So I guess what I'm going to ask is it really a priority for the United States? And particularly given all the different issues that President Biden has to deal with today. And so is it a priority? And if it isn't, how can we make it a priority, or can we make it a priority? So I'm going to turn to my American colleagues first, and I'm going to put Jenny on the spot first and ask her to try to answer that question.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I don't think the administration, especially the people who have been appointed so far, see North Korea as the highest priority or as the biggest risk out there, like some of our Korean colleagues believe or perceive it to be. I think even in 2017, when North Korea tested its first ICBM, I think that was the first time Americans really internalized that North Korea was an actual existential threat. But I think the belief that North Korea would actually attack the US is very low, which makes it lower priority. But I think the other problem we run into right now is the risk of political reputation and reputational capital right now. And I think in terms of where the Biden administration is willing to put their reputational capital, be willing to shoulder the criticism that comes with bold decisions and big moves, I don't think the appetite is there to do it on North Korea, whereas you can get a bigger bang for your buck, so to say, if you're doing it on domestic issues, on racial justice, on COVID-19 management, and the legacy issues of the Obama administration, such as the Iranian deal and other issues like that, the Paris Accords. So I think, unfortunately, while we in the Korea community see this as a very big, pressing, growing security issue, the political capital isn't quite there in the administration to take it on in the way that we would need to in order to really make some progress.
Can I jump in there?
What's your perspective, Suzanne?
I think, Jenny has made some very compelling points, and we have to put it in context. I'm not making excuses for the Biden team in any way, shape, or form, but look at the context they're coming into. He's entered office at a moment of unprecedented, intensifying crises. It's a real daunting array of domestic challenges, a spiraling COVID pandemic. We're more than a year into this, and it still isn't under control. The death toll just here in the United States alone passed 500,000 just yesterday, I believe. And the rollout of the vaccine is just exceedingly slow. And we also have a major economic crisis and a Congress that doesn't seem to be able to come together on putting a package of relief together for the American people. And we also have a country that is riven by political division. We saw what happened on January 6th, a violent insurrection. And an alarming number of Americans still believe that this election was stolen from Trump. And I haven't even mentioned the racial divisions, the social upheaval, and these divisions are animated by a white supremacist movement. So that's a lot to come into. It's a collision of crises, and of course, President Biden's immediate focus is rightly on our domestic situation. I haven't even mentioned the range of challenges in the area of foreign policy, and of course, China is going to likely dominate that agenda. Also repairing and strengthening our relationships with allies. And this is where I think North Korea could come to the fore, as if Seoul is really pushing that agenda. Also addressing the global climate crisis and not only dealing with the current pandemic, but how do we prevent another one from happening? So this is already quite a very large agenda. And I do think there is going to be a very strong resistance in the new administration to expend bandwidth, political capital, as Jenny said, on this issue, an issue that has been very uncertain. Few diplomats have succeeded in delivering deals that have lasted. But even so, I would contend that there's a very strong case to be made for starting a process with the North Koreans early rather than later. I think it's better to take the initiative, certainly before the North Koreans make a provocative move or a number of moves. I mean, this is what happened with the Obama administration. Those moves started happening, and the Obama administration was then caught on defense and never really fully recovered from that. And I think even in the absence of a provocation from Pyongyang, a strong case can be made for initiating diplomacy. First of all, because the North Koreans are never going to initiate it. Second of all, it does give an opportunity to set the table for engagement for the next few years at least. So the Biden team might be less than excited about pursuing a proactive approach, but I think at another event we were at, Joel, the other day, I made the point that a big lesson we should take from our past experience with North Korea is the more we kick this can down the road, the more advanced their arsenal becomes, and the more limited our options become. So I hope that the Biden administration is taking stock of past experience, learning those lessons, extracting some best practices, and come out on this issue where I have better to be proactive than reactive.
I think this is one of the fundamental problems in dealing with this issue. And it happens time and time again. If the North Koreans are fairly quiet, and that is combined with an American administration that has other priorities on its plate, then very little gets done. On the other hand, if the North Koreans act up, test ICBMs, maybe test more hydrogen devices, then everyone's going to run around pulling their hair out. And by then, it's too late. We're going to be in that cycle of going to the UN, trying to get sanctions, trying to ramp up pressure on the North Koreans. And I doubt if the Chinese are going to be very cooperative this time around. So, I agree with what everyone has said, but it's a trap that administration after administration has fallen into. And it's one that I would hope the Biden administration would avoid. But one of the things that is interesting, and one of the things that might help avoid that trap, is looking at who is going to handle North Korea in the administration. We have no idea at this point, except maybe Kurt Campbell. Who are going to be the people leading the charge? And that's a very important point. And so I'm wondering, how should we handle this inside the US government? And I'm gonna turn to Suzanne one more time, and then I'll move on from this issue. But it's important that someone lead the charge.
Yeah,
I'm not saying you have to name a person,
yeah.
but who should that be? Should it just be some, pardon me for saying this, mid-level foreign service officer, or someone with more stature?
Well, we don't know yet, but I would take a few different approaches if I was advising this administration. One would be quiet diplomacy, first and foremost, as a way to pursue and try to send signals to the North Koreans through interlocutors, track 1.5 and other ways that give elements of the kind of approach we're thinking about. And we can talk about what that approach is, what would get the North Koreans' attention. I think there are a few elements that would. Besides that, I would reactivate the intelligence channel, which I think the North Koreans have responded to well in the past. And now we have Bill Burns has been put forward as director of the CIA. What's great about that is he knows North Korea well. He's a diplomat, so he understands the importance of good intelligence to advance sound diplomacy and policy. So that makes me very optimistic. And I'm not just saying that because he's my current boss. I really think that it was a very inspired choice. So that's another element. But in terms of who is going to lead that team, whether it's Kurt Campbell or maybe someone like Wendy Sherman, who has been nominated to be Deputy Secretary of State. She could follow the Steve Biegun model. While he was Deputy Secretary of State, he was also Special Representative for North Korea, although he didn't engage North Korea much during that period, but that's certainly a model that could be followed. And I agree with you, Joel. The person and the people are going to be very important. You know, there has to be some chemistry, but more than that, an understanding of the North Koreans themselves. But beyond that, we also have to get to the substance. And I think ideally, whoever's leading that should be someone who is seasoned enough to know the history of our engagement with North Korea, has studied it closely, perhaps has even been involved in previous interactions, and has really taken the time to learn lessons from it. Time and time again, I know this is a pet peeve you and I share, Joel. We hear some former officials say, we tried diplomacy with North Korea, it's not going to work, and therefore, let's not try that again. I just, I could use very colorful language as I have with you in private about that, Joel, but I'm going to resist. I just don't think that's acceptable. I do think that, especially in the case of Kim Jong-un, what we did see during the Trump administration is he did, that leader-to-leader approach did resonate with him. And I just don't think that the Trump administration, the way they carried it out was not serious because of the president himself. But I don't think we have really fully tested whether sustained diplomacy with Kim Jong-un is possible. And I really think, I really hope that the Biden administration does.
You know, I just want to second what Suzanne has said about the intelligence channel. I think many of us know there has been an intelligence channel for quite a while with the North Koreans, pardon the noise here, starting in 2009. And what is interesting to me, having studied that channel, is that the Iran experience of secret talks was very different from the secret talks with North Korea. Very different in the sense that it didn't happen every day, but there were many meetings initially, many that were not successful. They weren't intelligence people. Bill Burns, who was part of that, as Suzanne knows, but they stuck with it. And the Obama administration's intelligence channel was the deputy director of the CIA would fly off to Pyongyang once a year to tell the North Koreans they had a choice. They could either choose this bright path to the future or the path where they would be isolated. And, you know, so that's not useful. So I think what we need to do is replicate that Iran, the initial Iran experience. Sit down, talk a lot. A lot of it isn't going to be useful, but you might get to a point where it would be. So what I'd like to do now is change the topic a little bit. And, you know, I'd like to go back to our Korean colleagues and, you know, assessing President Moon obviously only has another year. I guess it's a little over a year in office. And so I'd like maybe starting with Dr. Wang. I mean, how do you assess from a Korean viewpoint what has been accomplished over the past 4 years with North Korea, both by particularly by President Moon, but you know, you're welcome to talk about President Trump also.
Okay. So before I answer your question directly, I would like to add some of my point to the previous question about whether the North Korean issue should be the U.S. The first priority of the U.S. national security. Then it seems to me that I think that there is a saying that, you know, that during the Obama administration, that if the Obama had the 15 important foreign policy agenda, that the North Korean issues ranks on 16th. You know, you remember that. I think that it may be also the case in the Biden administration. Although the Biden moves very quickly for the domestic agendas, but he's relatively slow in the overall the foreign policy agenda, even with the Paris the climate change agreement. But he has not actually started to work on the Iran issue, and in this situation, that there is not much room for the North Korean issue. That's why the many people talks about the strategic the patience. So they are now conducting the North Korean policy review, but I'm not sure how long it will take, maybe 3 months, 4 months, and they're wondering. But I'm still wondering whether the Biden will move on to deal with the North Korean issue right after the policy review. I don't know so much as you do about who's going to take care of the North Korean issue in the Biden the administration. But maybe it seems to me that the Secretary of State Tony Blinken is also interested in the North Korea issue, because he also has written the article in the New York Times 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, and also talked about the North Korean issue and then compared it with the Iranian issue. And also regarding your question about the Moon Jae-in government, it seems to me that the Moon Jae-in government, hopes that the engagement still works for North Korea. Then engagement will continue to define U.S.-North Korea relations. So many people may not agree to that assumption, but still, the South Korean government has that kind of idea. So, above all, the Moon administration hopes to persuade the Biden administration of the merits of the small deal and the interim agreement. Although it failed in the Hanoi, summit meeting, U.S. North Korea summit meeting, the February 2019, but still the Korean government wants to expect that thinking about how to to reuse that kind of thing. So from Seoul's Moon Jae-in government perspective, the advantage of maybe the small deal and interim agreement is that the sanctions relief would help kickstart that the inter-Korean economic the cooperation, and the Moon administration sees the economic project, including the rebuilding of North Korea's roads and railroads, all the reopening of the Kaesong industrial complex. We understand that which is very difficult to achieve in the near future, but still, the Moon administration, believes that could be the first step on the way toward the steady easing of the bilateral tension between the United States and North Korea. Okay.
Thank you. I just want to briefly, I'm going to briefly turn to Dr. Kim, and then I'm going to get to Jenny with the question. Dr. Kim, I've noticed your background. You spent 27 years in the Ministry of Defense, which is quite an accomplishment. So you're our resident defense expert. So I want to come at this question from that angle, which is, after 4 years of what's happened the past 4 years, do you feel South Korea is more secure or less secure than it was before President Moon took office?
Very tough questions. I think during the Moon Jae-in administrations, there has been a real progress in inter-Korean relations. In 2018, as we all know, that there was a real progress, and we had a high hopes and expectation. Although now it is overshadowed by the disappointment and frustrations. When it comes to the security and stability, I think now we are better off than in the past, because there have been no major North Korean provocations since 2018, although there have been no real progress. And also from the military perspective, I believe that the deterrence is robust. Deterrence is working. It is frustrating. We cannot solve the North Korean nuclear issues. And I know that many people are worried about the credibility of the US extended deterrence. But I think that the deterrence against the North Korea is quite strong. The more difficult question, the issue is the assurance issue. Many South Koreans are anxious about the credibility of US, the commitment, US, the extended deterrence. But from the military perspective, I think North Korea is not a position to provoke, to try a major provocations. So yeah, that's my assessment.
Thank you. One last question. I'm going to turn to Jenny. I know both of you gentlemen sort of delicately sidestepped coming to a yay or nay on your administration's policies, and I understand that. But maybe Jenny doesn't have to delicately sidestep it. Jenny, what do you think about the past 4 years of President Moon's policies?
Well, you know, I think Moon really ramped this up to be the center of his policy and the center of his political legacy of improving inter-Korean relations in a sustainable way. And unfortunately, I don't think the process that was started is going to be sustainable. And I think that's going to work against him and his party in the coming elections if major changes aren't made this year. And I think part of the problem was, you know, yes, he was very ambitious, and sometimes you have to make these bold moves in order to start to build confidence and build the right political environment for negotiations to move forward and be hopeful. But I think part of the problem was in the beginning, by having the summit so quickly, the Panmunjom summit so quickly, and agreeing to the majority of an agenda that required international cooperation in order to implement, without having that international cooperation consensus in advance, it really kind of stacked the cards against him. And so now we're in a position where there's still a lot of good intentions in South Korea. We don't know if that will continue past a Moon legacy unless there's major changes in the relationship this year. So I think if we had to give it an actual score, I think it's on the lower end or closer to failure, simply because it was built up so high to begin with.
Thanks, Jenny. So I see we're 45 minutes into our session and there's still 45 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is, I know we have a number of questions from the listeners, and so I'd like to start asking the panelists the questions. And I have to rely on my trusty staff to feed me questions. So, and I'm getting a whole bunch of them, so please bear with me. I'm sort of on overload here. Yeah, so one question is, of course, very interesting, and it may go to the heart of the matter, and I'll open it up to anyone to answer who wants to. You know, one of the signature events, obviously, of the Trump administration was his summits with Kim Jong-un. And so he really broke the mold. I mean, no sitting US president would meet with a North Korean leader before that. So do you think that President Biden should continue to have summit meetings with Kim Jong-un And if you do think he should have them, what should he do differently from what President Trump did? So I don't know, does anyone, I guess, Suzanne, do you want to go first and then we'll go to Jenny?
Sure. So actually, I really was a supporter of the Trump administration's leader-to-leader initiative with Kim Jong-un. You know, I remember being in Pyongyang just several weeks after Trump's inauguration. And at that time, some officials actually raised the idea of a summit. I thought it was, you know, unrealistic, that it was too soon, but apparently the administration thought it was a good idea to move forward. The problem with it was that it really lacked a coherent strategy, and it really lacked negotiations at the working level. The team that was negotiating, I don't think was ever really fully empowered. And as we've learned from John Bolton's book, and I think Bob Woodward's book, there were a number of people involved in this group that were actually working against each other, undermining diplomacy, sabotaging it. And then beyond that, the objectives itself were so unrealistic. So the idea of complete, full denuclearization, plus on top of that add, you know, you have to give up your chemical weapons, you have to give up your biological weapons and so forth. It was just a non-starter. It was diplomacy never stood a chance, I think, in that context. So that's why I said earlier, I don't think this has really been tested yet in a serious way. So I hope that the Biden administration, and they've commented a bit on this already, they are not taking off a summit, a leader-to-leader summit. They're not taking it off the table, but it's going to be one of maybe an array of ways they want to engage the North Koreans. I don't see Biden himself moving forward with a summit-level meeting unless there was something substantial that was already pre-cooked or close to being agreed to already there. And I agree with that approach. And I think in another venue, we had this discussion. What would be a good approach? I think the interim deal approach is the way to go. And I do think reviving the Yongbyon deal that had the Yongbyon facility on the table in exchange for sanctions relief would be a good place to start. But of course, those details have to be worked out in advance. So in sum, I really hope that the Biden administration continues to keep this on the table as an option, pursues it seriously, is willing to do it if it merits a leader-to-leader approach. The way I've put it before is with Trump, it was the right initiative and the wrong president. So maybe we're going to get it in sync where we have the right initiative with the right president. I hope so.
You know, one of the things that I wonder about is, you know, I wonder about Kim Jong-un. He's not his father or his grandfather. And I think we can see from his behavior, certainly at the summits, and we can see from how his negotiators behaved, that it's quite likely Kim Jong-un wants to make the decisions. He's not going to let anyone else decide. And so that, as a negotiator, that kind of leaves you handcuffed. You can't talk about important issues. Yeah, so Jenny, I was going to turn to you and see what you think about that proposition.
Yeah, I think that is one of the realities of having started down the summit-driven negotiation route, is that Kim Jong-un does see himself as a negotiator now. And that was part of the problem with the working level meetings in the past, was that, you know, the North Koreans were not empowered to deal with the issue of greatest importance. And that was the technical nuclear give or ask. I do think it's hard to imagine that Kim Jong-un is just going to relinquish that back down to a working level discussion going forward. So I do think there's a role for summits. There's a continued role for summits, but I think we need to rethink how we prep for them. And part of that is using some of the tools that were developed over the Trump administration, and that is these letters going back and forth, where there are some things that you can negotiate at the working level. But if there's still some issues that need that contact with Kim Jong-un directly, in order to make progress, there's a way to present them in private in these letters going back and forth in a more substantive way to make sure that we have a better sense of what would actually be the outcome of a summit. Because I think as much as we don't want to go back to a summit and come out empty-handed, I'm sure the Biden administration doesn't want to. I don't think Kim Jong-un wants to either. He doesn't like going in front of audiences and admitting failures. He had built up the summit process, I think, and what was going to come from relations with the US and South Korea built up over 2018, 2019 to a very high level to have to then admit that it didn't really amount to anything. So I think he's going to be risk adverse in that way as well. So the more we can have that certainty, but factor in the idea that he wants to be involved in that conversation, I think the better chances we'll have of actually being able to make progress.
I think Jenny raises an excellent point, and that is that, it is possible for leaders to exchange letters, and certainly President Trump did that, although I think some of the substance was probably not very appropriate. But in fact, in the past, and particularly during the Clinton administration, there were very detailed exchanges of letters, not between President Clinton and Kim Il-sung, but between chief negotiators. So the issue is, could you elevate those exchanges of letters to a higher level? And could you combine that with some sort of senior negotiating forum, maybe like the intelligence channel with someone like Bill Burns, and work those two together in a way that might help break, Kim Jong-un's hesitancy to let anyone else negotiate? I don't know, it's just an idea. Let me move to our South Korean colleagues now. And I have a question for Dr. Kim, and I think it's an interesting and important question. For Dr. Kim, and then we can, Dr. Wang, you can sort of chime in after Dr. Kim, because it's a defense issue. One of the questions I forwarded before the session started was, what do we do about exercises? We have an exercise coming up. I assume that's going to stay at a low level. It's not going to change. But in the future, what do we do about exercise? And particularly, what do we do about the idea of shoring up our conventional military defenses that can strengthen the assurance that South Korea has that the US security guarantee is not eroding, that is staying strong? So I wonder, Dr. Kim, could you give us your perspective on that?
All right. Yes, joint US-ROK exercise has become a thorny issue on the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. From a military readiness point of view, the joint exercise is an integral part of the alliance and should not be compromised. And moreover, right now, the United States and South Korean government are pursuing the transfer of operational control based on the conditions. So the joint exercise is considered necessary for verifying the conditions. On the other hand, as we all understand, the joint exercise can have a negative impact. So it is worried that the North might choose to make provocation in response to the exercise. It is hard to predict the Pyongyang's response, but it is surely not a good signal for North Korea. And I mean, even within the South Korea, there are different views on the exercise. And even within the South Korean government, there have been different views. The Ministry of Unification expressed its wishes to delay or cancel the exercise. The Ministry of Defense is preparing for the exercise as scheduled. And right now, there is no enough time to rethink about the exercise at the top level between the Washington and Seoul. So the exercise in March is likely to be held as scheduled. And hopefully, North Korea may not respond by provocation this time. The exercise this spring is a computer simulation based without field maneuvering. And I mean, in the future, I think we can think about modifying the joint exercise as a part of the negotiation with North Korea. If the modification of the exercise can be helpful to for the negotiation, I think we should think about that.
You know, one thing I did want to raise with you, which I think has gotten very little discussion, is if you recall in October, in the North Korean military parade, there were a number of new conventional weapon systems on display. And I think that was a big surprise. I mean, everyone was fixated on the missiles, but I think the new conventional weapon systems, for me at least, were a bigger surprise. So I'm wondering how you assess that affects, you know, the future of the alliance, the future of our defenses against North Korea.
So what do you mean by conventional weapons, like it's not the missiles, or right?
No, like tanks and other weapons.
Yeah, all right. I mean, in terms of the conventional weapons, I don't think the North Korea can compete with the South Korea. It's simply not possible. So they can show some conventional military weapons capabilities in the military parade. I mean, but it's not a match of the South Korean military. If you look at the military budget of North Korea, it's not the wise choice for North Korea to improve the conventional military capabilities. So I think the North Korea will continue to focus on the strategic, development of strategic weapons, missiles, and nuclear capabilities. That is the concern for South Korea. When you look at the military parade, it looks like impressive, but if you really think about their resources and their capabilities, the conventional military capabilities is not the number one priority concern.
So basically what you're saying is it may look nice in a parade, but they're not going to be able to build a lot of them.
Yes, I think so.
That's a very good point. Why don't we turn now to the, more the specifics of what deals might look like. So I think one of the issues that, I don't know if there's a lot of debate about it, but I'm just curious, how do you all feel about what should be the initial steps that the Biden administration should take with North Korea before we even get to a deal? What should we do to sort of telegraph what we're interested in? And I think Suzanne is probably the right person to ask this question, because it's part of the review we did. And so now's the time to plug our review, Suzanne.
Finally. Oh, just kidding. Yes, so I think there is there are a couple of things the Biden administration can do to set the groundwork for testing diplomacy with North Korea, and maybe setting a conducive negotiating environment. In other words, what is going to get the North Koreans' attention and enable them to get to saying, yes, we'll meet or we'll engage. And I think one of the things we put forward in our paper is to really reaffirm the principles in the 2018 Singapore Declaration. So this was that document that came out of Trump and Kim's first summit in June 2018. It's only a page. It's rather flimsy. It's by no means a negotiating agenda or a roadmap. But I would say if we looked at it as a statement of principles, that it could be the starting point for building an achievable agenda, then it really lays out the pieces nicely. And why I think it would appeal to Kim if we did this is, first of all, he negotiated it. As Jenny said, it's very important that he was the negotiator. And secondly, he signed it. His name is on it. Also, the fact that the paper itself gives equal weight to both denuclearization, doesn't define it, to building a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, which of course is his key goal. It puts it on equal footing. So that would be a signal to him that the Biden administration would be willing to maybe go down that route. I know that the instinct might be to just throw everything that Trump did out the window and never look at it again, but I think that would be a big mistake for the reasons I just mentioned. And then the second is talking about the current suspension in the major military exercises that we just talked about between the US and ROK, and the suspension of North Korea's nuclear and long-range missile tests. If we could reach an early agreement or understanding with the North Koreans to continue that, that would then provide some space and time to initiate diplomacy, build it up, and even do some confidence building measures. So this is an area maybe where perhaps even Beijing could play a positive role. And even the Russians, they have a proposal, I believe, in the UN Security Council about this very idea. And I think a goal here should be, can we get to a point where we can codify this mutual suspension while negotiations are in play? So those are two very simple steps, not simple, but two very early steps, I think, to take to signal to Kim some things that he might be interested in hearing about. And then, of course, somehow we have to get to communicating to him, if indeed this is the Biden administration's position, that, and I would advise it, and that is making a clear break with the Trump administration's maximalist approach, the so-called Libya model, which really demanded complete denuclearization up front before any concessions could be given. And we need to move to a stepwise process where the establishment of peace on the peninsula and a reframed process for denuclearization is on equal footing. I think those three key elements would get Kim's attention.
Can I ask our Korean colleagues, as I'm listening to Suzanne, I'm thinking, what could the Biden administration do, aside from engaging North Korea, to really jumpstart the North Korea North-South process? Are there steps the Biden administration could do to sort of give President Moon more latitude in pursuing engagement with North Korea? And I think specific steps is what I'm thinking about. And I'm not going to mention the one I'm thinking about. I'll let both of you sort of guess which one. So I want to start with Dr. Wang. What could the Biden administration do to help President Moon move forward?
Yes, this is the wonderful questions. I think that we cannot just move directly to the denuclearization, the negotiation, because both the United States and North Korea are not ready for the kind of deal. First of all, we need to think about the humanitarian, the aid to North Korea. In fact, that the Korean government, seems to believe that the Washington and Seoul, could offer aid to the North Korea, on the COVID-19 pandemic issue, but actually officially the North Korea is the coronavirus-free country. There's been no confirmed cases yet, but still, North Korean government is really concerned about the pandemic. So in exchange that the Washington and Seoul could insist that the Pyongyang maintains the moratorium on the nuclear and the intercontinental ballistic missile or long-range missile test. So this could help build trust between the two and serve as the springboard for a more complex negotiation in the near future about the North Korea's denuclearization. So maybe there could be some very good the cycle between the inter-Korean relations and also the U.S. North Korean relations in terms of this kind of humanitarian aid to North Korea. And the Korean government also already has stressed the importance of diplomacy in dealing with Pyongyang. So the Korean government, they hopes to persuade the Biden, the administration to on the nuclear negotiation, that the working level between the U.S. and the North Korea and also South Korea would help persuade the Pyongyang to sign a deal, including the ultimate goal of denuclearization. But that cannot happen in the near future. But eventually we can move toward the ultimate our ultimate goal of the denuclearization on the Korean peninsula. But at the first step, we need to deal with the very small things, and then the Korean government, they see some opportunity to launch a sustainable and the diplomatic process and the inter-Korean cooperation, potentially also involving China to in order to make North Korea engage in a proper negotiation about its nuclear program. But right now, the problem is that North Korea is not ready to, talk about that issue, given that the 8th Party Congress the last month.
I can't remember which one of you gentlemen, it may have been Dr. Kim, raised the issue of lifting sanctions. Mm-hmm. And so what I was trying to get at in my very clumsy way is, what about lifting sanctions that affect the Kaesong industrial zone? I assume that's still something that President Moon wants to do. And I think that the United States would have to cooperate in that. So that was one of the things I was hinting at just now. And I don't know if one of our Korean colleagues has a comment on that.
Yes, in addition to the North Korean nuclear issue, to South Koreans, the inter-Korean cooperation is important. The Moon Jae-in administration wants to restore the inter-Korean relations, hoping a virtuous cycle between inter-Korean relations and U.S.-North Korean relations. The South Korean Unification Ministry has made some proposal to North Korea to break the deadlock. But this approach can be effective only if Pyongyang responds to South Korea. But until now, North Korea has not responded. Instead, Kim Jong-un called on South Korean government to resolve the fundamental issues. The reason why North Korea has not responded to South Korea is that they believe that the South Korea doesn't have much latitude, much room, and that has to do with the sanctions. So, if South Korea to try the economic cooperation project with North Korea, some kind of the restrictions need to be, relieved. So as Joel mentioned, the Kaesong industry complex or the individual-based tourism, in order to try that kind of the cooperation project with North Korea, I think the United States and South Korea need to talk about revising the sanctions regime. That is helpful for the inter-Korean relations.
Yeah, thank you. I want to switch gears for a second because obviously there's a big elephant sitting in the corner of this room, and that is China. And so I wanted to turn to Jenny because she spent a lot of time talking to Chinese experts in China. So I want to ask you, Jenny, how do you assess the prospect of convincing China to help us out on this issue, given the current situation in US-Chinese relations?
I don't think we can expect much help if our approach is going to be pressure oriented. I think the biggest, the most obvious clash right now is a clash in approaches. I think the Chinese look at the North Korean situation, see the direction North Korea wants to go, sees it as an opportunity to incentivize North Korea and pull them into a more international regime and create greater obligations for them in the international community. So any kind of approach that goes in to say, well, no, we have to keep punishing, making this a punitive approach, to pressure North Korea to do certain things is not going to get cooperation, especially in this political environment. I think in 2017, there were a lot of factors that led to an unprecedented level of cooperation with the Chinese. And part of that was driven by the North Koreans themselves, just their behavior and the instability and uncertainty that it was bringing about was bad for Chinese interests. On top of that, you had the potential for US-China cooperation that would incentivize China by avoiding a trade war if they were to cooperate on North Korea. And certainly they did cooperate and they still got the trade war. So I think that kind of give and take deal is that the Chinese are going to be much more skeptical going into that in the future. But if we're looking at an approach that does provide more incentives and more off-ramps and more opportunities for North Korea, if they continue a certain behavior and encouraging that kind of behavior, I think there is room for cooperation. But I think that's really the only way we're going to get them to cooperate, unless North Korea goes back to a very provocative stance.
Suzanne, did you want to add anything to that, or?
No, I just want to agree with what Jenny said on all counts. And the one thing I think, there were some in the previous administrations who really put all their eggs in the basket of China, really looked to China as they're going to solve this for us. We need them to solve it for us. And I don't think the current administration is going to look at it that way. And I think that's a good thing. I think we need pragmatic approach, as Jenny outlined. If it's an all pressure, all the time approach with no diplomatic off-ramps, then I don't see the Chinese lifting a finger to help, unless, of course, it becomes in crisis mode. They'll want to prevent that. So I do think, for example, what I mentioned before, the Chinese maybe helping us, helping to convince the North Koreans to continue this moratorium on testing in exchange for suspension of exercises would be a good first step.
Thank you. Thank you, Suzanne. I'm going to turn to another elephant sitting in the corner of the room, and I'm going to direct this question at our Korean colleagues. And so we have a question, what can Japan do to contribute to an allied approach to North Korea on these issues? And I'll leave it to you to answer that or not answer that, as you can choose either way. Dr. Wang, do you want to try that?
Well, it is a tough question for the Korean scholar. So I'm not the Japan specialist, but in Korea, many people believe that the nuclear issue should be, dealt with between the U.S., North and South Korea, and because that between the Korea and Japan there is the latter of issues that should be resolved, and many Korean people do not want the Japanese, be directly to be involved in this the North Korea issue, the honestly speaking. But anyway, the Korea-Japan cooperation and also U.S. Japan Korea, the trilateral the security cooperation is really important in the deterring the North Korean military threat. So we need to separate what we can do and from what should be done in Northeast Asia. And then so based on this, the Korea, Japan, US, the trilateral security cooperation, it's really important to move on to denuclearize North Korea, because we share that the eventual goal, but we may have some different ideas how to deal with North Korea, but eventually we share that the ultimate goal of denuclearizing the North Korea.
Dr. Kim, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, Japan can be the constructive the participant if Japan agree with the shares the U.S. ROC strategy in dealing with North Korea. But sometimes Japan has a different agenda, different priority, like the abduction issue. So when Japan is included, the coordination among allies and friends can become a little bit more complicated. So the North Korean nuclear issue is the issue of between the United States and North Korea, and also the South Korea and China are the major player, and Japan and Russia, I think, are the minor player in this game. So sometimes six-party talks can be held, but it is basically the four countries of the game, I think.
Yeah, I agree. When I was working on these issues, we had very good cooperative Japanese allies who were fully on board with what the United States and South Korea were trying to do. And I agree with you, that's changed over the years. So I guess we can hope that we're able to renew that kind of cooperation in the future, because it would be very helpful. So let's hope for the best on that score, at least. We're running short of time. We have a bunch more questions. So I don't think we're going to be able to get to everyone, but let me throw a softball at Suzanne. I have a question about what is the US really interested in when it comes to North Korea? Peaceful coexistence, which may not be quite the right words, but peaceful coexistence or regime change. And I think what we should do is is focus that question on the administration we have now, the Biden administration.
Yeah, so I guess that's a question. It really depends on who you ask and which administration. I'm going to, just based on my own assessment of who's in the Biden administration, I don't think they are going to pursue a policy that thinks regime change is anything, a realistic goal at this stage. I just don't see that happening. I mean, even though Kim Jong-un and North Korea are weakened by economic distress, the flood damage, food insecurity, and they seem to have managed the COVID situation well, although we're not 100% sure. But even that is still not over. So there is a situation there that's fairly dire. But at the same time, I don't think there's any indication that Kim is going anywhere or that North Korea is on the verge of imploding. So there's probably a good level of realism that if they want to make progress with North Korea, they're going to have to deal with the current government. And I think that's probably the case. You know, I am struck by how a couple of different people associated with the Biden team have invoked, as you said, the Iran model in the case of North Korea. And that indicates to me that there is an appreciation that this all or nothing model is not going to work, that a pressure model with no room for diplomacy or an off-ramp or concessions on the sanctions early in the process are going to work. So I do hope that at the end of this policy review, there is a more pragmatic approach that reframes denuclearization. Let's be frank, this administration is not going to abandon denuclearization as a US goal with North Korea. But what they can do is make it a realistic version of denuclearization, cast civet aside, think of it as how to make the North Korea's nuclear and missile arsenal less threatening. What are some limits that can be placed? How to make it a bit more transparent, more achievable goals that can go on a step-by-step basis. And at the end of the day, we have to be prepared to offer meaningful sanctions relief for meaningful limits on their program. It's not going to be the end of their program, but some limitations. And if they take that approach, then I think they might get somewhere. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Suzanne. I think we're about at our final question, which I'd have to stop and think about for a few minutes if someone asked me this question. So I'm just going to throw it out there, and maybe I'll ask our Korean colleagues first. It's an interesting question, and it's sort of what would happen if we changed our approach to North Korea and let North Korea and South Korea negotiate on reunification, focus on that, promote dialogue and ties between the two, and make denuclearization one of the conditions for reunification. I personally think that wouldn't work, but I'm wondering how, since we're talking about South Korea and North Korea, I'm going to turn to our Korean colleagues, starting with Dr. Wang. What do you think about that?
It is another tough question, the relations between the denuclearization and the unification issues that we know that I also agree that those two goals should be achieved, in the Korean peninsula. But I don't think that when we talk about the unification, I don't think that the denuclearization is the necessary condition for that. Although we, move toward two goals, but there's very, different kind of context between those two, because maybe regarding the denuclearization issues, maybe that's the more international the context and the current, context, and then the South and regarding the unification issue, there's a more complicated, context between South Korea's domestic and North Korea's domestic issues, and also the international context. So, of course, both should be, correlated in order to bring the peace back on the Korean peninsula. But there's some kind of the different, the context between these two. There's very, the difficult issues to talk about that, about whether the one, brings the other to the Korean peninsula.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And maybe we should ask ourselves the question, which one is more difficult to achieve, reunification or denuclearization? And I think they're certainly probably both just as difficult, and one may be more difficult than the other. So it might not be a discussion that would make a lot of progress or produce a lot of results.
So it's very difficult to say which one is more difficult to one that. Maybe today the denuclearization is a more difficult issue. Maybe tomorrow the unification issue.
I'm trying to be diplomatic.
Yeah.
I think the unification is much more difficult, and I think it's the unification is the wishes of all Koreans, but it's not the first priority. The Korea is now pursuing peace first, and the dialogue of unification is not helpful to achieve peace, because if you raise the unification, North Korea feel threatened. So I think it's much more desirable to focus on the denuclearization, to focus on the stability and peace first, and then the unification. It's not it should not be a policy goal right now.
I think that's a very good way of stating it. And if I was a North Korean, I would see this as an effort for regime change. So I think we got to be very careful about that. At some point, it may be possible to talk about those big issues, particularly reunification, but not in a situation where there are periodic tensions like this. So I think we're at the end of our time. It's 8:30. I want to thank the Sejong Institute, the Una-Korea Foundation, for helping us with this event, sponsoring this event. And I also want to particularly thank our speakers for a very interesting and good discussion. I hope it went by as quick for everyone else as it did for me. And thank you, everyone. I'm sorry that I didn't get to all the questions. It's very hard to fit 35 questions in 40 minutes, so I apologize. Anyway, so thank you, everyone.